COVID-19. My name is Andy Haynes. I'm a for-profit developer with Gatesburg Road Development out of State College, Pennsylvania, and I'm also a board member of the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. I'm the moderator today. We have a great panel today, and let's introduce them. First up is Laura Esso. She is from REACT, Environmental Professional Services Group. She's been with them since '07, and she leads their due diligence group, which includes phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments and federal due diligence. She specializes in environmental project management for multifaceted, affordable, multifamily housing projects. Then we're going to work on to Mary Johansson from Kitchen and Associates. She's a principal and a licensed architect. She is passionate and committed to the design and creation of affordable housing. Since joining the firm in 1994, her focus has been on the development of projects that rely on low-income housing tax credits and other federal and state funding programs typically associated with the development of affordable housing. And finally, we'll wrap up with Bill Kerr from High Schwartz Law Firm out of Norristown, Pennsylvania. Bill has over 25 years experience in zoning, land use development, and particularly taxation appeals for affordable housing projects. Bill, you didn't provide my intro, so I made one up for you.
You did great, Andy. You did great.
Yeah.
I thought I sent it. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. So first, we're going to get started with Laura. You want to put the screensaver up? And we're going to hold all the questions and answers to the end. So if you put your questions and answers in the chat box, we'll address them at the end of the presentation. All right, go ahead, Laura.
All right. Here we go. As Andy said, our title today is New Challenges to Making Development Budgets Work. And so I'm going to start us off by talking about how environmental considerations play into your project budget. So there's not much new to say in terms of environmental as it relates to COVID. But I think there are still good things to keep in mind as you are budgeting for your project and taking into account your environmental reporting, environmental conditions, and things that you would need to address in order to document compliance with regulations to the satisfaction of either a regulatory agency or to your lenders. So the overarching thing that point that I want to make is that thorough initial due diligence is key. That's really important for setting up your budget well and avoiding surprises down the line. You want to get as much information as early as possible about site history and environmental conditions. So just knowing what you're dealing with and knowing what's going to be coming in the months and sometimes years that follow your initial site due diligence so that you don't have surprises. And the look of a site can be deceiving. So just driving by a property and or walking through a building and getting your just sense of it is not always accurate. And I have a slide for that coming next. But in doing initial due diligence, you want it that allows you to anticipate your environmental work that will reduce budgetary surprises. So it's not necessarily, in some ways, in some instances, it can cut out budgetary items that you may have thought you needed. Maybe you sampled for vapor and you don't have a vapor encroachment condition or something like that. And then getting a project team with whom you can collaborate really, really helps. Getting and establishing good communication among the project team. So, the team really is a lot of the folks who are in this, on this panel, between your developer, your architect, sometimes council, your general contractor, all the people who are going to be in the mix throughout the project, because environmental really can run the lifespan of a project from initial due diligence through to final occupancy. There can be environmental components that are needing to be taken into account, documented, inspected, whatnot throughout the process. So as I said, looks can be deceiving. So here are two projects that I've worked on recently in Pennsylvania. One of these needed to be remediated through Act 2, and one of them did not. You might guess, just based on how I'm leading into this, the site on the left with all the drums and buckets and just overall scary appearance was just a disposal situation of just characterize that stuff and get rid of it appropriately. The grassy site on the right with the fence and the trees, that had to go through Act 2. That was a former industrial facility. The buildings obviously have been demolished, but there was dirty dirt underground, some tanks and all sorts of things. And so just looking at the surface doesn't always give you the full picture of what you're getting into. And so again, that initial due diligence, sometimes beyond a phase 1 into sampling, will allow you to budget appropriately, both for cost and time. And for something where you would need to go through Act 2, just incorporating those elements of that program into your construction timeline and coordinating with the GC when the environmental folks need to be on site, perhaps for well sampling or something like that. And other things to take into account, and this is something that's becoming more, I would say in the past couple of years has come to the forefront more so, is budgeting appropriately for export and soil movement. That getting an accurate guesstimate of your soil budget early on is also going to be really, really helpful as you get into the construction phase of the project. Knowing what the cut and fill plan is and showing and bringing the environmental consultant into the conversation. Is it a balanced site? Is there net import? Is there net export? There are cost implications with those, particularly with export. Are you in a situation where you are being required, like through Act 2, to cap the site? How thick does that cap need to be? Is that going to generate net export on a site you were planning to be balanced? And then also stormwater. The PADP is paying more attention to stormwater drainage features and soil quality at those areas. And so all of these different components of the soil movement part of the project have budgetary implications. It's not common that all the dirt on your site is going to be clean, which is the cheapest to move. And so budgeting early and bringing the appropriate players into the conversation early will prevent surprises. You know, you don't want to get to ready to put in your final sod and realize that you need a 2-foot clean fill cap and your site is at grade. You know, that's you really want to avoid that. And so having conversations early and making sure that the developer and the consultant and the GC are, and and the site work contractor and all the appropriate players are communicating well, can get ahead of a lot of those things, which are going to cause time and budgetary impacts later in the game than you want them to. And then in just a year ago, in January of 2020, the PADP updated the Pennsylvania Clean Fill Guidance. And now soil classified as clean fill also matches statewide health standards. Before that point, something could be clean fill, but not meet statewide health for a cap on an Act 2 site. But now it does. And so the guidance has changed, and characterizing your materials for export, you know what, characterizing materials for export ahead of time also helps the project to run more smoothly. And so you don't want to get to closing and have your site guys ready to go tomorrow and not have your soil characterized for export. But there is a timing consideration with that, in that the sample results have a shelf life of 6 months. And so you want to have, to the extent that you have site access, and already have your export and cut and fill plans laid out, it is beneficial to have that export characterization sampling done ahead of the day you want to start site work, but also not something you want to do as part of your initial due diligence when you're doing that first phase one, because there are shelf lives for things. And so just getting knowing what you have to do and getting the pieces in line earlier rather than later helps eliminate surprises, helps just give clarity to the budget. Even though there may be expenses you didn't initially plan for, they're coming with enough lead time rather than scrambling at the last minute. And so just overall soil movement during construction is something in the past couple of years has gotten a lot more focus and has been a source of just some sticking points in process because of lack of good communication and planning across the project team early on. So that's something to keep in mind. And then other things for environmental, funding sources have specific guidelines that may differ from quote unquote industry standard. If you're doing just a commercial loan or a market rate loan and you need an asbestos survey, or if you're in at least in the city of Philadelphia, you need an asbestos survey to get a demo permit. There's a sort of industry standard of sampling requirements there. But a lot of public funding entities require your asbestos survey to match the ASTM standard, which is much more extensive in its sampling requirements and comes with a higher price tag. So that's something to keep in mind, as well as radon sampling may need to meet the ANSI ARST guidelines, which again have more robust sampling requirements than sampling that might be happening outside of a specific funding source. So knowing what your funders require in terms of environmental sampling and guidance documents when you engage your consultant will help get ahead of delays when you submit all your documentation and they say, hey, does your asbestos survey meet ASTM? And if it doesn't, then you have to go back. Something to keep in mind is that remedial work can occur throughout the construction process. So having to go through Act 2 doesn't mean construction is on hold for 2 years. They move concurrently. And as I said before, good communication between the entire project team is really important for helping that to move smoothly. And just keeping your environmental consultant as part of the project team through to the end. A lot of times there is documentation that will need to be provided at the end of the process. We might do a phase 1 pre-acquisition, and 2 or 3 years later, a lender is going to say, I want documentation that tells me that everything identified in that initial report has been appropriately addressed. And so keeping the consultant in the loop as the project goes on sets them up to be able to provide that packet of documentation at the end more easily because they're in the know. And also as things come up or you uncover things as site work progresses, you have a knowledgeable consultant as part of the team. And so that just goes back to, doing good due diligence up front and maintaining good communication between all members of the project team can really help reduce sticking points and surprises when it comes to environmental, and gives the consultant time to come up with multiple solutions, because there may be multiple ways to address something. And when there's time to consider those alternatives, it puts a lot more options on the table. So those were, that's what I wanted to share today in terms of environmental and your development budget.
Okay. Laura, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
The Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency and also the policy of the Biden administration is really pushing for projects to be adaptive reuses, that we focus on utilizing existing buildings or sites for the development of affordable housing. Sometimes this includes industrial sites or former retail shops. Do you guys see, what do you see the challenges to this? from an environmental consultant perspective?
Yeah, those are the fun ones. When you've got a neat old building.
For you.
Yes. I think that's when you're going to interact with a lot of the more like structural building related things. You're gonna be dealing with asbestos, lead paint, lead in water, radon. And so addressing all of those building things that come along with having an old building. You may have disposal. I'm going to go back a couple slides. This picture of the building on the left, that's an adaptive reuse project. And so you've got some housekeeping to take care of that you wouldn't have had on a piece of vacant land. And so, and that there also, I think, is a lot more coordination with the site folks, the GC and whoever else, with the consultant, because you're having to coordinate something like asbestos abatement with the work they're planning to do on a floor. So is abatement going to be done in the whole building, or are they going to go floor by floor, and kind of the abatement contractor is going to be one step ahead of the site guys, how you're going to handle that. Yeah. So I think it's just important to understand what all the requirements are from your various funding sources in terms of reporting that needs to be done, and then just coordination among the team to make the pieces fit together as smoothly as possible throughout the process. Great.
Okay, thank you. So if anybody has questions for Laura, please put them in the chat room, and we'll do it we'll address them at the end of the presentation. So next up is Mary, who's going to give us a design and construction perspective.
So it's no surprise to everyone that the newest, biggest challenge that we are currently facing is COVID-19. It has impacted so many aspects of our lives, how we work, where we work, as well as our industry developing affordable housing. Yesterday's session in the morning, as well as this morning's affinity session, addressed the impact that it's had on tax credits, financing, occupancy, lease-up. What I'd like to do is share a little bit about how it's impacted the design and construction of affordable housing. Could you go to the next slide? So there have been current impacts, things that we're dealing with right now on projects that are under construction, in design, as well as moving through the overall development process, as well as long-term impacts. The current impacts are really labor, materials, and schedules. Labor can be broken down into 4 areas. The subcontractors. When COVID-19 hit, it really hit a lot of small general contractors, subcontractors, and vendors, the guys we rely on when we're building affordable housing. Many of them have gone out of business. And I think when the pace of construction resumes, that's going to be an impact that we're going to feel immediately as well as in the long term. Many of the companies who are still around, the larger contractors who were bigger and healthier, whittled down their workforce. A lot of seasoned veteran workers retired early, taking with them their expertise. Smaller crews were formed, so they are running a leaner business at this time, and that has an impact on what we do. When there are fewer guys to build, building does get affected. This has also affected labor costs. With COVID-19 protocols, outfitting workers with PPE, sanitizing protocols, not being able to share equipment and tools on a job site, those tend to drive up labor costs. And when you think about construction, it's not just one guy doing it. Often it's a team or a small crew who need to execute a specific task. Well, finding workarounds that you can still accomplish work with one guy because the next worker is 6 feet apart, that becomes very, very difficult. And these have resulted in delays in construction, delays in getting the labor force to the site. with fewer workers to go around. Sometimes the smaller projects, the smaller trades are the ones who are last on the list to get staffed. I think one of the areas that we've seen labor impacts, labor delaying projects is in asset preservation, where we have an existing building that's likely occupied and we're going to go in and we're going to renovate the apartments and the common areas. When COVID-19 hit, so many of those projects nearly shut down because no one was going in and out of those buildings. Often they're senior residences, and you're moving someone out of their apartment one day and back in that evening in order to do the work. That was not happening. So that labor has impacted those, the progress on those projects significantly. Could you go to the next slide? Materials. As we've all been to the supermarket and we've seen the area where there's usually all kinds of chicken to buy and there's none. When you go to find your favorite cookies and they don't have them. When you are looking for your cereal and it's not in stock, or toilet paper or Lysol wipes, material availability has been impacted significantly by COVID-19. What we found is that with a lot of people staying home, home improvements by homeowners was increasing. So those materials related to wood studs and drywall and deck materials, things that a homeowner might be doing on their own at home, those were hard to come by. That impacted what we do. We build from those same materials when we're constructing affordable housing. One of the biggest impacted materials was lumber. It was in such short supply that crews were waiting and waiting and waiting for it on projects. This is not just because the demand is up, but also just like with our favorite cookies, manufacturing plants aren't making everything. Not every product is being produced at the same volume, so that there is a shortage in the supply chain. Also delivering the materials to the store, to the plant where it's purchased, those have impacted material availability as well. So when the supply is short and the demand is high, costs go up. We've seen costs escalating with some products at twice the rate that we would anticipate in a normal calendar year. Things such as appliances and cabinets, not only are they short in availability, the cost also went up. The biggest impact in cost was lumber. And almost all the affordable housing we build uses lumber. And I've got a statistic from the National Home Builders Association that between April and August of 2020, the cost index for lumber doubled. These are our studs, these are the wood trusses, these are the wood floor joists and roof trusses. Between August and November, the price moderated. Now we're in January, the price is going up again. And that has a real impact on what we do, because almost every affordable housing project relies on lumber for its construction source. And then timing. We've seen delays in getting the product to the site. So not only do you have a reduced labor force on site, sometimes they are waiting around for the materials to arrive so that they can frame out the walls, put in the installation, start the drywall installation. It has taken a significant impact on many of the projects that have been under construction this year. Could you go to the next slide, please? Schedule delays. COVID has impacted the overall development timeline significantly. Not just towards the end when you get to construction, but everything from getting your planning and zoning board approval, because early on, for the first several months of COVID, planning and zoning boards were shut down. Within about a 3-month window, many started to have virtual meetings, so hearings were resuming, but not at the pace that they had normally. And some of the more complex, larger developments, the towns were not going to a virtual meeting. They were actually scheduling an in-person meeting, but you had to wait several months. So we're seeing delays with municipal approvals. seeing delays with environmental approvals and other state approvals, where previously you may have had a 90-day window that you would get a certain environmental approval. All bets are off, because when the staff at the state were furloughed, their work didn't stop flowing in, it just backed up. Obtaining building permits, many local construction departments have reduced staff and reduced hours, so getting a permit has taken significantly longer. As I was mentioning, labor and materials, those have affected the progress of construction. Having restricted or limited access to buildings has impacted renovation projects. And what we've seen is projects needing to kind of rethink that schedule. Contractors trying to find a different way to have construction progress, maybe by phasing the project or resequencing their work in order for them to continue working, but at a slower pace. Building inspections have slowed down. Occupancy inspections have slowed down. So getting, having lease up in a timely manner has been delayed, sometimes many, many months, because you're waiting for that final inspection to get your TCO to be able to start moving people in. And with affordable housing, we know that that has an impact on placing your units in service. Luckily, an extension with that has taken the pressure off, but time is still passing and there are still projects that are struggling to get their occupancy inspections. Can we go to the next slide? So those were really the current impacts, and many of those are going to have long-term effects on our construction. I think we're going to still continue to see fewer subcontractors available, workforces that are leaner, just as after the recession in 2008 and 9, when workforces dwindled and we were all doing more with less. I think we're going to continue to see that. It's going to take time to rebuild a workforce with the expertise that we've relied on for years and generations. Material availability should begin to rebound once manufacturing and production resumes normal pace. I think we're still going to see higher prices on some materials, maybe not as high as they are now. Some may regulate, but I think in general, this is going to drive up some costs. And lastly, I think schedules will eventually return to normal. I think this is something because there are so many things we rely on, other organizations or agencies or municipalities to help our schedules move along. I think we're still going to see those longer than we have in the years past. Could you go to the next slide, please? So that was construction. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact that COVID is having on design. We're now a society where we're all spending a lot more time at home. We're working from home. Our children are going to school from home. Many of us have multiple generations living under one roof. So our home space is getting a little bit taxed. And what we're seeing now is more consideration given to the layout of the apartments. Maybe not so much the square footage, because that does affect the budget significantly, but with the space we have, what are we doing? What can we do better? What can we do different? Trying to find space that you can put a small desk for a child who might be learning from home. Where can you put a laptop? We're looking at building more breakfast bars or open layout kitchens that have a countertop that you can not only have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner at, you can also work at. And to make this work, the two little things that everybody needs is Wi-Fi that's reliable and power. Little things like giving a little more consideration to where we are putting the electrical outlets. Normally in affordable housing, the engineers go through, they know what the code says, and we put the minimum in. And they're not always in the most convenient space. And what we're finding is that for a few extra dollars, you can budget a few more outlets where people can charge their laptop, where they can plug in a monitor for their children, where they can create a little workspace at home because they're not only connected by Wi-Fi, but they've also got power. In the common spaces, we're also seeing some reconsideration of what spaces we're building, how big are they, and how we're using them. You know, in the past, one big community room was sort of the standard. Senior building, family building, whether it's in the clubhouse or whether it's on the first floor of the senior residence. These have been a little bit problematic for some of our clients who have had to shut them down. And because over the years we've made them more open and welcoming, some without walls and doors, some clients have had to remove the furniture and put up police caution tape to keep people out from congregating in large groups. So we're seeing that more consideration of the spaces that we're building for group activities. Can they be separated with operable partitions or accordion partitions so that you could have multiple activities if you break down the larger room into smaller? Also having walls and doors that you can secure the space if you need to kind of prevent people from just naturally congregating there. One of the other things that we're seeing in our senior buildings is a bit more control in the entrances. It's nice to have a very welcoming, open entrance, but if you need to be able to welcome people in through the vestibule and into the lobby, you sometimes need to secure that. So we're seeing more clients ask for a way that we can have like an inner set of doors. That way you can still have visitors come, but they don't have free access to the entire building once they come through the front doors. Could you go to the next slide? Some of the other impacts on design that we're seeing that is having a significant impact on what we're designing. Deliveries starts at the site. There are many more trucks providing Amazon, FedEx, UPS, USPS deliveries multiple times every day, 7 days a week. It's not just the mailman anymore. We are seeing food deliveries. And where do they come? Where do they queue up? Where does someone come out to meet them? That's had a significant impact on some of our tighter sites, especially in our senior buildings where you've really got one main entrance. And when you've got a lot of traffic there, it makes it difficult for the seniors to pick up and drop off, as well as their family members who might be getting them. So really thinking about the site design and where you're going to have deliveries come. Where are those packages going? We are now starting to design mail pavilions that are not just a mailbox kiosk for family development, but also Amazon package under a little roof so that they stay dry. And even what we are planning today isn't necessarily accommodating the demand. Once we've all learned how to order things from anywhere we want, whether it's food or goods, that's not going to change, that level of convenience. So we do need to be designing for that on our site as well as in our buildings. We're seeing that we're taking some of the storage areas near the entrance in our senior buildings and transforming them into package locker storage. We're taking some areas that we had also designed for scooters or carts that often seniors need at the front door, and we're moving those out, putting doors on to be able to secure them for package delivery. Outdoor space is another area that we are seeing a renewed interest. Covered porches, patios, gazebos, pavilions where people can meet and be socially distanced outside, meet with their family and not needing them to come into the building, as well as spaces that do double duty, covered patios and porches that can be used for Tai Chi or yoga or other kinds of fitness. The last thing I wanted to touch on is indoor air quality. And as Andy mentioned, we're kind of building our buildings tighter these days. And that's because building codes have gotten more restrictive, energy codes have gotten more restrictive, which on one hand is good because we're building them tighter. We're also required now to bring in outside air. So controlling the air, the fresh air that comes into the living spaces. And this is a tremendous benefit when new construction, apartments, or townhouses have individual systems. It's a much healthier way to go than back in the day when we had common systems and the air was being shared between common spaces and apartments to apartments. So already the new codes have helped us with new construction and indoor air quality, as well as allowing us to have a higher level of filtration to filter out the particles that could carry more virus. We're seeing more common spaces having individual smaller systems. So the management suite has a separate system from the community room, the fitness room, or a laundry room. They're all having individual systems, which really helps prevent air flowing from one to another and possibly moving contaminants through the air. So in closing, a couple things that I think we can all do when we're looking at our development budgets. I think it's so important that you update your budget often, more often than we have in the past, that you preserve that contingency because you will need it. Material costs will go up and down, labor availability will affect labor costs, and just the overall duration of the project is a little bit less known these days. We're seeing more time for approvals being budgeted. We're seeing more time for permitting, as well as time for construction, because there are things beyond our control that affect the schedule, and time is money. And the longer you're in construction, or if you have delays, that does result in some hidden costs towards the end of the project that you're pretty much saddled with because you need to open your building and get your residents in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. You answered my question about the impact COVID would have on on moving forward. One thing we're looking at on our new projects is improved Wi-Fi, and also now we're looking at access for delivery trucks to get into the site, probably more than we ever did before. And as a developer, I will just add that we are typically adding about 3 to 4 months on our construction schedule, on our development schedule, to cover longer lease up, longer construction, delays if someone has COVID on site and you need to shut down, development approvals. So you're right on with those things. And what's interesting, and if I could just add, and I'll turn it over to Bill, is in 2008, when we had the Great Recession and tax credits, corporations stopped buying tax credits and the investors disappeared, we had some big challenges and we got through it, and we're getting through this. But what's interesting is back then we saw construction costs go dramatically down. We rebid things and our prices came down dramatically. That's not happening now. They have less workers. The materials are harder to get. Sometimes it takes 6 months to order bathtubs. For some reason, bathtubs are become like, I guess it's because of toilet paper. I don't know, but it's an interesting time. So with that, let's move over to Bill. Bill's going to talk about some of his challenges for operation budgets related to taxes.
Yeah, hi, Andy. Good to see you, Laura and Mary. I learned a lot just sitting here listening. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Hearing the impacts of the COVID situation on Mary, on Andy, and a little bit from Laura, it's just really been amazing. And the other thing that's kind of amazing is that we're sitting here at the Housing Alliance conference this year on Zoom. And one of the things that I was always told when giving a presentation or a seminar is that you want to make it interactive. You don't want to just be a talking head. And here we are, just a bunch of talking heads. And the other thing that sort of comes to mind is I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan, and he has one of his newer songs that is one of my favorites, is one called Radio Nowhere. And the theme is, he's a musician, he's putting his music out, but is anybody listening? And one of the lines is there anybody alive out there? And that's kind of how I'm feeling when we do these Zoom calls. But anyway, having given that as my intro, I'm going to talk about two legal aspects of affordable housing that have cost implications. And I've sort of broken it up into pre-development and post-development. The first one we're going to start with pre-development. The first one I'll talk about is transfer taxes. Now, in Pennsylvania and in many states, whenever a property is transferred, transfer taxes are imposed. And that's the case in Pennsylvania. And the transfer is imposed either on the sale of a property, the sale of a partnership interest or an entity interest if it's more than 98%, or even a long-term lease imposes transfer taxes. And the transfer taxes, as are indicated on the slide here, are generally 2% of the fair market value of the property, of the lease, 2% of whatever it is that you're selling. That's in most counties in Pennsylvania. The exceptions in Pennsylvania are in Philadelphia and Allegheny counties, and there's probably a few others. The transfer tax can be 4 or even 5% of your price, your transfer price. And as indicated on the bottom of the slide, the value and the amount of your transfer taxes is the purchase price. Now, if you're selling a property and there's a purchase price that reflects the value, you just look at that purchase price, you multiply it by 2% or 4%, depending on where you are, and that's your transfer tax. If you're in a situation where there isn't necessarily a stated purchase price, but because it's a transfer of partnership interest, or you're transferring from a related entity to the ultimate tax credit partnership or entity, you may not have a purchase price. So you end up with a deed that has a dollar value on that. And that's really the area that I wanted to focus on, because that's where I found that you can run into some surprises. Because if you are transferring it like that to an entity, and there is not an actual purchase price, the state is going to determine your real estate transfer tax based on the current county real estate tax assessment. That'll be the tax assessment as of the day that you close. And I've had situations, and I had just one about a year ago, where it was a property that was owned by a nonprofit. They had never really focused on the real estate tax assessment because it was a nonprofit, so they weren't paying real estate taxes. So when we actually, and I suggested to them as I first got involved in the project, that we look at the assessment once I realized that it was going to be a dollar deed essentially, because it was going to a related entity. We looked at that. We found out that the property value per the tax assessment was about $20 million. And the transfer tax based on that would have been about $400,000. And no one had ever budgeted for that or even contemplated that. So we had the time, we were able to actually file a tax appeal and get the property reduced to a more reasonable value, because the property, if you valued it based on what it was, affordable housing, it was only worth about $4 million. So we were able to get the assessment reduced very significantly. We cut the transfer taxes from $400,000 down to about, I think it was about $75,000 or $80,000. So it was a significant differential and significant cost savings for the project. So that's, I guess, the first thing I wanted to impart today is from a legal perspective is when you're getting involved in a project like this, think about, and always keep that in mind. What are my transfer taxes going to be on the transfer of this property into whatever entity is ultimately going to own it. You can jump to the next slide, Andy. Now, the other thing that's more relevant, I guess, because it affects all projects, all deals, all complexes that are built under the LIHTC program or whatever other affordable housing program you're working with, are the real estate taxes. Pennsylvania requires that every property pay real estate taxes unless you can qualify for an exemption. Most LIHTC, or not most, but all LIHTC properties are not technically eligible for a real estate tax exemption, because the fundamental threshold for eligibility for a real estate tax exemption is that it has to be owned by a nonprofit. And even if your main participant in the entity is a nonprofit as far as management and control. Because you have the for-profit entity involved, with a LIHTC deal, you're not going to typically get a real estate tax exemption. So you're always going to be paying real estate taxes, 95% of the time. I say 95% of the time. There are certain counties that I found that the tax assessment office and their solicitors are willing to work with you and actually well, I'll get to that a little later. But anyway, the real estate taxes I find are typically end up being in the range of 8% of your rental income to 20% of your rental income. 8 to 12% is the best case. And that's where as I work through the process, both pre-development and post-development, we try to get the projects into that ballpark so that you're paying 8 to 12% of your rental income as real estate taxes. And what that translates into is it's around 1 month's gross income should go to pay real estate taxes. If you're significantly below that, you're doing pretty well. If you're significantly above that, you need to look at ways to reduce that. Now, the real estate taxes are determined, as are the transfer taxes in some cases, in all cases with real estate taxes, by the county real estate tax assessment. The state law says that the real estate tax assessment has to be based on the value of your property. And the dilemma that we have is that these properties are costing, 10, 12, 15 million to construct. And if you use that value as your the basis for your real estate taxes, none of these affordable housing deals would work. I'll get into that in a minute as well. But the other piece of the equation, in addition to the real estate tax assessment, are your millages. There are typically 3 taxing authorities that impose tax millages on real estate. Those would be the county, the school district, and the municipality. The school district typically has the biggest piece, probably 70 or so % of the real estate taxes. You can flip to the next slide, Andy. So pre-development, obviously you want to budget for real estate taxes. And how do you do that? A good source is PHFA. They keep data on the real estate taxes, which are being paid by every affordable property they're involved in the state. So they can give you some guidance, and they'll actually expect that your budget reflects their history and their experience with other projects in that particular county. We also want to talk to the county assessment office. Some of the county assessment offices actually have a stated method by which they assess properties. Berks County, for example, Philadelphia County, they both have predetermined values that they assign to affordable housing. So you can get some information there as to what those predetermined values are and figure out where your taxes are going to come out based on those predetermined values. The other place is your legal counsel. Your legal counsel, if they have experience with this, they should be able to guide you to a place that's fairly likely as to where you're going to come out with real estate taxes. I get calls all the time from clients that as they're going in with their applications, they ask me to put together letters that they put in their applications, which actually is my analysis of what I think their taxes are going to be based on the county, based on their budgets. If you want to jump to the next slide, Andy. The other thing to keep in mind in your budgeting is that there are some tax reduction strategies that you can contemplate and sometimes even have in place before or in the time frame in which you're submitting your application. There are tax abatement programs in various counties. The state, Philadelphia actually has its own 10-year tax abatement program, which is right now, it's been pretty good. It's been in place since 1998. And basically you get a 10-year abatement of the increase in value on the property based on the construction and the improvements you put on. So it's been a very successful program in Philadelphia. A relative of that is what's known as the LRTA program. This is a state, a program that's included in the state assessment legislation. And it basically allows you to do something like the 10-year tax abatement in Philly, which is to get an abatement on a portion of the increase in value based on the improvements that you're making. Another thing to consider is a payment in lieu of taxes. And this is what may be applicable in some of those counties I spoke about that don't really care if you have a for-profit entity that's owning the property. If there's a significant nonprofit involvement, they'll allow you to, rather than paying taxes under the just the regular tax assessment, they'll allow you to basically enter into this agreement with the taxing authorities, one or more of the taxing authorities, which allows you to pay taxes based on a budget that makes sense for, or a number that makes sense for the budget that you're looking at. And then there's also an assessment appeal, which typically follows the construction, but sometimes you can do an assessment appeal beforehand to get the assessment into a place that makes sense for the project in the budgeting stage. So that's pre-development. Now, Andy, if you jump to the last, I guess this is my last slide. No, actually, we have 2 more slides. Post-development, what happens is the project is done, you get your certificate of occupancy, and the county is going to issue what they refer to as the interim assessment notice, which will basically say this is the change in your assessment based on the work that you did. You have a right to appeal that assessment notice back to the County Board of Assessment, typically within 40 days of the date you get that interim assessment notice. When you're getting to the end of the project, make sure you pay attention to that, because I've had many cases where there's a lot going on, but you're never quite sure where the county is going to send the bill because there's been a transfer of ownership. And sometimes the folks that get the mail just don't recognize that this interim assessment notice comes in, and you end up with a new assessment. You don't find out until a year later that you've got that increase in assessments, and then it's very difficult to go back and undo that increase in assessment for the year for which you missed the right to appeal the assessment. So there is that interim assessment. If you miss that interim assessment notice, you have the right to the annual appeal for the following year. But again, if you miss that interim assessment notice, you may end up paying full taxes for that the year that you missed the assessment notice for. So there's an annual appeal. That typically has to be filed in August or September of the year prior to the tax year. So we just filed appeals in September of 2020 for 2021. So you do have that right. Once you file that appeal, you get a county assessment board hearing where you go and you present your case as to what you think the real value is. You get a decision from that. Then there's also the ability to appeal that to court. Looks like we have 5 minutes or so left, so we're doing pretty good. Anyway, last slide, Andy. And hopefully through that process, the appeal to the Board of Assessment or to the court, you end up with an assessment that should stay in place in Pennsylvania for a fairly long term, because in Pennsylvania, you don't get annual changes in your assessment. You get changes based on improvements you make to the property. Sometimes the school districts will file appeals, but on affordable housing, it's unusual. But you can get increases in taxes based on tax millage increases, because again, that's the second part of the equation, in addition to the real estate tax assessment. And what happens over time is that your tax millage increases, the fact that your budget only allows you to go up rents on average 2% a year, the millage increases may track inflation more closely, and you also have other expense changes. You may end up with taxes that, even if you start out okay in the level of taxes, that 5, 6, 8 years out, your taxes have gotten out of line with where your budget is at that point. And other things that come into play with regard to whether or not the taxes are appropriate is what's the market bid, real estate market been in the area where your property is located, what's the appreciation or depreciation been in the in the real estate market. And that's all reflected in the county common law ratios, which is, I look at all those things. If someone comes to me and say, hey, are my taxes fair, 6, 8, 10 years after a property is in place. So the last point I'll make is that, again, once you get your taxes in line following The project startup, once the project is occupied, it's a good idea to every 3 to 5 years to just revisit that. Look at the taxes and make sure that they're still in line based on what the actual value of the property is. So that's all I have prepared. So Andy, any questions?
Yeah, there actually is a question for you, Bill, from the chat room. Question is, many counties in Pennsylvania have old base years for their assessments. How challenging has this been in getting a fair assessment?
Actually, that's not all that bad, because the state law really trumps that base year per each county, because the state law, the state tax equalization board every year puts out what they call the county common level ratio. It's reflected there at the second to the last bullet point. So it's that county common level ratio that really gets applied to the assessment to determine, what the current, it basically gets applied to that base year assessment to determine what the current market value is. And then you compare that current market value to what the actual market value is of the property based on, and because these are income properties, yep, market value is based on the income they're generating. So it's an additional nuance that you have to be aware of in those counties. But I haven't found that to be a significant impediment to getting tax assessments to be where they should be.
Okay. I will just add as an editorial comment, property taxes after a tax credit project is completed is one of our biggest challenges, especially in certain counties. They are very aggressive in valuing these properties much higher than what our developers think or what their councils think. So, Bill, do you foresee any legislation in the future that might help counties realize that these properties, though they cost $10 million to build, can't afford, are not really worth $10 million if they were sold?
No, unfortunately, I don't see anything in the future. Andy, you and I were part of the legislative process back in 2003, where we actually went into the legislature and had them add some language to the state assessment law, basically indicating that with affordable housing, you couldn't consider the value of the tax credits. So that a tax that, this costs $10 million to build, how could it be, worth significantly less? That portion of the statute attacks that, gives us ammunition. The other piece is that the legislation requires that the assessors look at the actual income and expenses. So we were hopeful when that went into effect in 2003 that the counties would be a little more lenient and a little more educated once they'd had 2 or 3 affordable housing properties built. But what we found is there are certain counties they're educated. They're pretty easy to get your numbers correct. But we have other counties where even if they know that they're affordable housing, they're going to value them like their market rate, and then you got to go through that process of the county board hearing, and then probably going to court because they're going to fight you. And the other piece of it is, and I have this fight right now, which is really pretty amazing, is that the taxing authorities, they see these big tax bills that are based on a construction cost or something just south of the construction cost, and they feel like they're giving up taxes when you come to them and say, no, the property is not really worth it. So they really want to fight you tooth and nail, particularly the school districts, because they see it as they're giving up a lot of value and a lot of tax revenue. So can get complicated in those counties.
Good question. And then there was another question to the group. I'm finding that developers are seeing skyrocketing insurance costs as some firms are pulling out of the market, viewing it too risky. How are you achieving reasonable premiums for affordable multifamily housing developments? Do you want me to answer?
I would just say shop.
Yeah.
Shop around.
Yeah, we're not seeing a huge uptick. We're seeing a little bit of a bump. Our insurance. We have a great insurance consultant who really looks around. Some of the issues on tax credit deals is insurance companies have certain ratings, like a AAA, AA, and the higher the A's, the better insurance company. So some investors want that better insurance company. So those people know they have kind of a capture on the market and are are pushing the price. So yeah, you got to shop, and you got to find a really good insurance consultant who understands it and is willing to do that work for you. I'd be more than glad if anybody wants it. I'll share my guy's name. He's out of State College here. He does a fantastic job. So there's no other questions in the group, and I think we're just about at our time window. So first off, thank you, Mary, Laura, Bill, and Andrea, for making sure we're staying on board. Our contact information is on the most recent slide, and this will be, I believe, will be recorded on the website for the conference. So thank you all. Be safe. Test negative. Get a vaccination. Let's get through all this, and have a great day.
Good advice.
Thank you. Bye.